It all started on what should have been a routine flight. A man in a sharp suit walked down the aisle, holding a first-class ticket he had rightfully purchased. He was calm, polite, and ready to settle into his seat. But moments later, the flight attendant leaned in and told him there had been a mistake. He would need to move. Whispers began to stir as other passengers looked on. He wasn't loud, he wasn't rude, just quietly shocked. After all, he knew exactly who he was and the weight of the influence he carried. But in that moment, the airline didn't. What they saw was just another passenger, someone they thought they could dismiss. What they didn't see was that this man was no ordinary traveler. He was the CEO of a global company valued at over $2.3 billion. A leader whose decisions shaped industries and whose reach extended across continents. And while he sat there, forced into a seat he never should have been denied, he began to think about what would come next, because sometimes the quietest reactions speak the loudest. And within minutes, the power he held in his hands would shake the very airline that tried to push him aside. The man sitting quietly in that cabin wasn't just a passenger, he was a leader who had climbed from almost nothing to the top of the business world. Born in a modest neighborhood, he carried with him the lessons of persistence, respect, and dignity. Every challenge he had faced only fueled his rise. And now, as the CEO of a company worth $2.3 billion, he had earned not only his wealth, but also the recognition of governments, investors, and global partners. Yet, on this flight, none of that seemed to matter. To the crew, he was just another face. Someone who could be moved without question. What the airline didn't realize was that this was not the first time he had faced being underestimated. He had lived through moments where his abilities were doubted, where doors were closed in his face, and where he had to prove, again and again, that he belonged at the table. This incident on the plane was just another reminder of those battles. As he sat back, his mind wasn't on comfort anymore. It was on principle. The quiet man in row 20 knew something the airline didn't, that actions like this never stay hidden, and soon, the world would find out. As the plane climbed higher into the clouds, he replayed the moment in his mind. The way the attendant avoided eye contact, the way a few passengers shifted uncomfortably, and the silence that followed it all spoke louder than words. He had the boarding pass in his pocket, proof of his place in first class, yet he had been moved as if his presence there was negotiable. The conflict was no longer about a seat. It was about respect, perception, and the hidden weight of assumptions. Meanwhile, whispers continued among the rows. Some travelers wondered why the change had happened, while others pretended not to notice at all. A businessman a few seats ahead caught a glimpse of the CEO scrolling through his phone, unaware that this passenger held partnerships that touched energy, technology, and even international trade. The airline had unknowingly touched a nerve that reached far beyond this single flight dot in another part of the cabin. A young employee of the same airline was seated off-duty. She had recognized him instantly, though she stayed quiet. She knew his reputation, his company's global reach, and the influence his words carried. And as she watched the scene unfold, she couldn't help but wonder what the fallout of this moment might become once the world heard his side. The hum of the engines filled the silence as he stared out the small oval window, the city lights shrinking beneath the clouds. To the rest of the cabin, it looked like he was lost in thought, but inside, his mind was a storm. This wasn't about a missed seat anymore. It was about how one careless action could ripple across an entire brand, an entire industry. The irony was sharp. This airline, desperate for prestige and loyalty, had just dismissed one of the very people who could decide its future. Every vibration of the plane seemed to echo the rising tension. He thought of the shareholders watching the markets, the government officials who sought his advice, and the thousands of employees in his own company who looked up to him as proof that barriers could be broken. How would they see this? How would the world react when it learned that a $2.3 billion CEO had been told to step aside like he didn't matter? Across the aisle, the off-duty airline employee still watched quietly, her heart racing. She knew what was coming wasn't small. This wasn't just a passenger's frustration, it was the spark before a fire. And before the wheels touched the ground, the story had already started to shift from a private slight to something much bigger. Just when it seemed the tension had reached its peak, another layer of the story began to unfold. As the CEO adjusted in his seat, his phone lit up with a flood of notifications. Messages from colleagues, alerts from his corporate team, and even calls he couldn't take mid-flight were piling in. Word of the incident had already begun to leak out faster than the airline could ever contain. Someone on board had quietly shared what they saw, and the story was spreading beyond the cabin walls. What made it worse for the airline was timing. Only days earlier, they had been in delicate talks with major partners who happened to rely heavily on the CEO's global company for logistics, contracts, and future investments. The very person they had brushed aside was the same one holding influence over billion-dollar decisions that could either boost or break their future growth. The off-duty employee watching from across the aisle felt the weight of the moment deepen. This was no longer just about one flight or one bad decision. This was about the collision of power, perception, and corporate responsibility. And as the plane cut through the night sky, everyone on board remained unaware that they were sitting inside the center of a storm. about to break wide open. When the wheels finally touched the runway, the tension that had been building in the cabin seemed ready to spill over. The CEO stood calmly, collected his bag, and walked off the plane without a single word to the crew. To those watching, it may have looked like he had let it go, but behind the silence was a decision that would soon shake the airline to its core. By the time he reached the terminal, his team had already mobilized. Statements were drafted, meetings scheduled, and within hours, global media picked up the story of the $2.3 billion CEO forced out of first class. The airline scrambled with apologies, but the damage was already spreading across headlines and stock markets. Investors grew uneasy, and partners began asking questions the airline wasn't ready to answer. Then came the unexpected twist. Instead of seeking retribution, the CEO made a move no one anticipated. He didn't just call out the airline, he announced his company's new strategic partnership with one of their fiercest competitors. Overnight, the balance of power shifted. What began as a single slight on a plane ended as a turning point in the industry. And as the world watched, it became clear sometimes the quietest passenger leaves the loudest mark. In the days that followed, the airline's leadership scrambled to repair the fallout. Press conferences were held, promises of new training were announced, and executives issued public apologies. But for many watching, the damage was already done. The story of the CEO forced from his first-class seat had become more than a headline. It was a lesson about respect, awareness, and the unseen influence one person can hold. For the employees who had witnessed it, especially the young off-duty worker, it was a moment that changed how they saw their own company. She often thought back to that flight, remembering how quiet the CEO had remained, and how that silence carried more weight than anger ever could. It was a reminder that real power doesn't always need to be loud. As for the CEO, he never looked back in regret. His partnership with the rival airline became one of the most talked-about moves in the industry, shifting billions in contracts and strengthening his legacy as a leader who could turn even a personal slight into a strategic advantage. In the end, the story wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about dignity, influence, and the simple truth that how we treat people matters because we never know who is sitting beside us.